Shri Chinmaya Sadgurave Namaha. Hari Om. Srimad Bhagavad Gita Chapter 5 True Renunciation. Introduction. The Holy Gita, authored by Param Poojya. Commentary by Param Poojya Gurudev Swami Chinmayananda ji of Chinmaya Mission. Chapter 5 True Renunciation. Introduction. This chapter opens with a doubt raised by Arjuna. It is almost similar to, but not the same as, the one he raised in the beginning of the third chapter. At the end of Krishna's discourses in chapter 2, the disturbed mind of Arjuna could not definitely come to a decision whether action had any place at all in the life of spiritual seeker. Here in this chapter, the Pandava prince only asks which of the two, renunciation of action or participation in action, is the nobler and the greater. The very construction of the question indicates how Arjuna has been persuaded rightly by Krishna's advocacy of right action and conscious resistance to all positive evil. The great Acharya had, to a large extent, hauled Arjuna out of his inward psychological disaster. He had regained a certain amount of equilibrium and had understood and accepted that action intelligently pursued was the right way for progress and self-development. To Arjuna, karma meant Vedic ritualism such as yajnas, yagas, homes, etc. And sannyas means renunciation of everything and total retirement to a quiet Himalayan jungle, living there in constant inactivity, a strange life of self-denial and perhaps conscious self-persecution. When this was the type of misunderstanding in the mind of an educated, intelligent member of royalty of those times, we can easily imagine how much more pathetic must have been the general condition of desperate ignorance into which the Hindus of that age had sunk. Krishna's attempt is to revitalize these dead terms in our scriptural tradition and bring about rehabilitation in the understanding of the Hindus, as is said in 2nd chapter, verse 61. We have already found in the previous chapter how the elaborate ritualism called yajnas have been brought out from their glass houses of secrecy and cellars of artificial sanctity into the broad daylight of everyday activity. The secret wealth of the Vedas, which was enjoyed by only a choice few, was nationalized to become a free heritage to be enjoyed by all seekers among mankind. With this subtle missionary work, Krishna brought Hinduism and its scientific methods within the life of every man living in the world. After thus describing Karma Yoga, chapter 3 and 4, Krishna had to describe how one should intelligently renounce karma and enter a nobler spiritual technique for completing the pilgrimage to perfection. To whip man out of his sleepy inertia. Vigorous activity is advised here as the first step. Activities are, at this stage, necessarily motivated by the individual's egocentric desires Inertia, tamas, is thus invigorated into the agitations of dynamic activity, rajas. This state is again to be transcended through the process of non egocentric divine activities undertaken in a spirit of goodwill and love for all, especially termed in the Gita as yajna. Thus sublimated, the individual reaches a certain amount of tranquility and peace, purity and joy, sattva. In this mental composure alone, can one meditate properly to reach the frontiers of the finite and experience the state of the infinite. This theory of self development in three definite stages of desire prompted activities, of desireless activities, and finally of pure meditation is not an original contribution of the philosopher poet Vyas, the author of the Mahabharata and the Gita. Even here we find that it is only an intelligent reinterpretation of the technique already indicated in the Vedas. In Vedic literature too, we find a systematic development of the technique of self perfection. The mantra portion of the Vedas expresses an all absorbing sense of wonderment of the deluded at the sight of nature's vastness in strength and beauty. The Brahman portion prescribes ways and means by which ritualistic activities can be undertaken for the satisfaction of one's material desires. After the Brahman portion, there is in all the textbooks of Vedas a clear section called the Aranyakas, which prescribes variety of worship methods called the Upasanas, which are to be undertaken by pure minds uncontaminated by any desire. These desireless activities, yajnas, make fine adjustments in the mind and intellect equipments of the seekers and provide them with a pair of wings with which they can fly across the finite state into the realms of the infinite. This same technique is confirmed by the Gita with slight adjustments here and there in the word meaning. In fact, the technique remaining the same, only the garb of language has been remodeled to appeal to the available fashions of thought at the time of the Mahabharata. This change has often been characterized by enthusiastic critics as a total revolution which has mischievous suggestions. Revolution is a term that is generally used when the old scheme of things is totally destroyed and is replaced by an entirely new setup. For example, the Industrial Revolution completely replaced the patriarchal scheme of social living that the West had before their windmills started revolving. No such destructive revolution has taken place with the introduction of the Gita by Vyasa or by the acceptance of it as a scriptural textbook by the Acharyas. And yet, the Gita represents a revolution. When a flower matures into a fruit, certainly it is a destruction of the flower as such, but in the fruit, the essence of the flower, namely its fertilized ovum, has found fulfillment. Those who do not know the science of plant life may mourn the destruction of the flower when they see the fruit standing where the flower stood before. But a botanist clearly understands that only the unnecessary aspects in the flower have withered away and that the essential in the flower has grown to its fulfillment in the fruit. Similarly, the elaborate ritualism, its show and mystery, its detailed preparations and arrangements, which constitute the bulk of Vedic books, have all withered away. The essential technique, which lies almost imperceptible in the Vedic volumes, has found a perfect fulfillment inasmuch as it has been brought out as a complete and self evident science in the Gita. Lord Krishna, after indicating the supreme goal of perfection, exhausts himself in the following two chapters, enunciating the methods of true activity. Activity in life, intelligently undertaken, is a means to reach the highest spiritual consummation. Primary education is as unavoidable as higher secondary education. For the student to fulfill his ambition to become a doctor or an advocate, an engineer or an economist, just as a student after his primary lessons must uh, enter the higher secondary class, after the fulfillment of which he must again strive hard to pass the early college lessons before he can hope to enter any of the specialized branches of education. So too, from desireless activities undertaken with a yajna spirit, a seeker must change over to the path of meditation. Chapter 3 and 4 have described the yajna, and chapter 6, 6 will explain the path of meditation. Therefore, this chapter has been rightly named the Yoga of Renunciation of Action, which is the spirit of renunciation. What is the spirit of renunciation? How the yoga of renunciation of action can be practiced? What would be the result of practicing this way of activity in this special mental attitude? And how far that could contribute to the inward development and growth of the human personality. All these are discussed in this chapter. In fact, chapter 5 stands as a bridge between Karma Yoga and pure meditation. In the Vedas, this subtle point in the chain of discussion is almost missing. Chapter 5 of the Gita rediscovers for us this missing link in the Vedic thought. I have said rediscovers and not deliberately creates or originally supplies. As Shankaracharya ji puts it, in many places the Lord has spoken of the renunciation of all actions, and at the close of the chapter, Krishna has advised Arjun to engage in yoga in the performance of actions. When thus viewed, there is in the last chapter a perceptible inconsistency according to Arjun. Hence the doubt with which he opens his discussion with Lord Krishna in this chapter. Arjun said, renunciation of actions, O Krishna, you praise, and again yoga, performance of action. Tell me conclusively that which is better for of the two. Arjuna uvacha संन्यासं कर्मणां कृष्ण पुनर्योगं च शंससि यश्रेय एतयोरेकं तन्मे ब्रूहि सुनिश्चितम्. It is evident that Arjuna has unconsciously walked out of the neurotic confusions in his mind and has started taking a lively intellectual interest in following the arguments of his friend and beloved comrade. action being in line with his own nature. Arjun very joyously and almost instinctively accepts the path of action indicated by Lord Krishna in the two previous chapters. Arjun, however, has not yet grown to be at complete rest with himself. To him, there seems to be a repeatedly jarring note in Krishna's discourse, inasmuch as there is a constant undertone, often very clear, in which Krishna insists that renunciation of action is nobler and diviner than all yajna actions, hence this inquiry. Moreover, a patient of hysteria, even when he comes out of it, cannot immediately discover in himself a complete self confidence. This is generally experienced by everybody. When the dreamer wakes up after a horrible dream, it takes some time for him to compose himself again to sleep. In the same manner, Arjuna, after the shattering experience of his emotional neurosis expressed in the opening stanzas of chapter 2, has not yet found his own balance to develop complete self confidence and feel capable of discriminating and understanding rightly the learned discourses of the divine charioteer. The Pandava prince concludes that Krishna is giving him a free choice between two independent ways of living, selfless action and renunciation of action. He therefore requests Krishna to indicate to him decisively one definite path of self perfection by which he can positively achieve his spiritual fulfillment. This chapter indicates to the children of the Vedas that these two are not two identical factors to be chosen from, nor are they a complementary pair of equal yoke fellows. Renunciation of action and full participation in action are two different exercises to be practiced serially and not simultaneously. This theme is elaborated in this chapter. The blessed Lord said, renunciation of action and yoga of action both lead to the highest bliss, but of the two, yoga of action is superior to the renunciation of action. Shri Bhagavan Vacha Sannyasat Karmayogascha Nishreyasakara तयोस्तु कर्म संन्यासात कर्मयोगो विशेष्यते. From the very type of the question with which Arjun approached Krishna in the opening verse of this chapter, the Lord understood the abject state of ignorance that Arjun was in. According to Arjun, Karma Yoga and Karma Sannyas Yoga were two distinct paths which would lead to practitioner which will lead the practitioner to two different goals in life. Man is essentially prone to be inert. If left to themselves, the majority of men would demand in life only food to eat with the least amount of exertion and plenty of idle hours. From this unproductive inertia, the first stage of man's growth is his being awakened to activity, and this is most easily and efficiently done when the individual's desires are whipped up. Thus, in the first stage of his evolution, desire prompted activity takes man out of his mental and intellectual inertia to vigorous activity. In the second stage of his growth, he becomes tired of the desire motivated activities and feels energetic when at the third stage of development, which will be discussed in chapter 6. To summarize, processes naturally, therefore, in this chapter, we are having a discussion on how we can renounce the ego motivated activities and learn to take to selfless dedicated activities. In this stanza, Krishna explains that both activities and renunciation of activity can take the individual to the highest goal. But he warns his disciple that of the two, participation in action, karma, is any day superior to the renunciation of action, karma sannyas. Here, we must understand that Krishna is not, in any sense of the term, decrying renunciation as inferior to vigilant and vigorous activity. To say so would be parading our ignorance or at least a lack of understanding of which the Lord has said so far, or the spirit in which he is continuing his discourses there hereafter. The Gita is given out in the form of a conversation between Krishna, the immortal teacher, and Arjun, a particular student facing a given problem and having some definitely known mental weaknesses and intellectual debilities. Essentially, here the Pandava warrior is full of vasanas, and to their exhaustion, he has to act in the battlefield. To those of us who are psychologically in the state of Arjun, and almost all of us are in that state, in that condition, suffering from the Arjun disease, the treatment is activity with the least conscious selfishness. The advice given here that the performance of action is nobler than the renunciation of action is therefore to be very carefully understood. Why not? It is said. 3. He should be known as a perpetual sannyasi who neither hates nor desires, for free from the pairs of opposites, O mighty armed, he is easily set free from bondage. ज्ञेयस्य नित्य सन्यासी यो न द्वेष्टि न कांक्षति निर्द्वंद्वो हि महाबाहो सुखम बंधात प्रमुच्यते. Why participation in work is said to be easier for a beginner than renunciation of action is explained here. While defining a sannyasi, Krishna's revolutionary statement cleanses the idea of renunciation from all its external embellishments. He gives more importance to the internal mental condition than to the external uniform. According to the Lord, he is a sannyasi who neither likes nor dislikes. Likes and dislikes, success and failure, joy and sorrow, and such other pairs of opposites are the wheels on which the mind rolls forward, earning the experiences of life. Our intellect can register a situation or a condition only with reference to the comparative estimate of its opposite. Thus, I can understand light only with reference to my knowledge of darkness. Comparison is the only way of understanding given to man. If there is no contrast for a thing, we cannot gain knowledge of that thing. If comparison and contrast are the methods of knowing for the mind and intellect instrument, then to renounce them is to renounce the vehicle. A car is a vehicle that moves on the earth. It cannot be used in water. Thus, if I am sailing on the ocean, I am certainly not moving in the car, but I am using a boat. which floats on water. If in the field of activity, in the field of plurality, where comparison and contrast are possible, I can use the vehicle of the intellect and mind. The stanza here states that he is a true sannyasi who has gone beyond the perception of contrast, which necessarily means that he is one who has transcended the inner instrument of mind and intellect. This is no easy task. To free oneself from the pairs of opposites is to be free from all the limitations of mortal existence among finite objects. But thus defining a sannyasi, Krishna is not trying to paint a dreary picture of hopelessness for the seekers. He has in mind the growth and development of Arjuna. The Pandav prince was then having in his intellect thick vasana coatings of heroic in- instincts, instincts and kingly impulses for action. This stanza is given in order to persuade him to keep away from a hasty dash into sannyas. For children, not the wise, speak of Sankhya, knowledge, and yoga of action as distinct. He who is truly established even in one obtains the fruits of both. साङ्ख्ययोगो पृथक् बालाः प्रवदन्ति न पण्डिताः एकमप्यस्थितः सम्यग् उभयोर्विन्दते फलम्. Two methods here are indicated for turning an ordinary act into divine action of dedication and worship. It can either be done by the renunciation of the concept of agency in every action or by a consistent refusal to get dissipated by our unintelligent preoccupation with our anxieties for the fruits of our actions. Our action. The former is called the Sankhya method and the latter is called simple Karma Yoga. The Sankhya technique is not available to everyone since the renunciation of agency is not easy unless the practitioner is highly intellectual and has in himself a capacity to see the collective universe in action. Only when we see the total logic of things can we really come to feel the insignificance of our individual ego in all our achievements and in our successes. Here, the Lord insists that only undeveloped childish minds can find contradiction between these two methods, while wise men who have lived either of the paths will vouchsafe for the equal effectiveness of both of them. Whether we practice the renunciation of our agency idea or live a life of detachment from the fruits of our actions, if we as seekers are consistently persevering in our chosen path, we shall come to the God. We shall come to the goal, which is the same whether we follow one or the other of the paths. How can a man obtain the results of both by the right observance of only one? The answer follows. 5. That which That place which is reached by the Sankhyas, Jnanis, is also reached by the Yogins, Karma Yogins. He sees who sees Sankhya and Yoga as one. Categorically, Lord Krishna Adena. यत् सांख्यैः प्राप्यते स्थानं तद् योगैरपि गम्यते एकं सांख्यं च योगं च यः पश्यति स पश्यति. Categorically, Lord Krishna insists herein that the goal reached by the Sankhya method is also readily reached by the karma technique. He who experiences this common goal of both paths is the one who really understands the truth of the Vedas. Here, the word seeing, pashyati, is used in the spiritual meaning of the term and so does not indicate a mere physical act of perception. In the Advaita philosophy, Atman is not seen as anything other than the seer, but it is the experience of the seer himself by the seer himself. Seer himself by the seer himself. The term seeing is used here only to confirm that the experience of reality could be as intimate and beyond all doubts as it would be when we see any object with our own eyes from very near. In thus synthesizing both Sankhya and Karma, it is not meant that they together form an alloy. They both must be practiced serially. We can consider them as one and the same inasmuch as Karma Yoga purifies the intellect and gives a greater poise for meditation. Sankhya, through which alone is the final experience achieved. Thus, a combination of these two is possible serially and not simultaneously. This is to be very carefully noted by all sincere students. How is it that the aim of Karma Yoga is sannyas? Listen. 6. But renunciation, O mighty armed, is hard to obtain without yoga. The yoga harmonized man of steady contemplation quickly goes to Brahman. Sannyasasthu mahabaho dukkhamaptumaya gatah yogayukto munirbrahma na chirenadhi gacchati. The Lord, with all the emphasis at his command, is declaring once and for all the final conclusions that were arrived at by the immortal sages of yore regarding the place of right action in self-discovery. Without performing of action, without performance of action, the renunciation of action is impossible. Without having a thing, we cannot renounce it. To perform, to renounce life and the world, because one has sadly been thwarted, is one's hope, in one's hope and ambitions is not renunciation. In this sense, the polishing of the mind is a process very similar to that by which we clean metalware by using metal polish. The item that is darkened by time is purified by applying some polishing chemical on its surface. The polish is the solvent of the oxide that is covering the brilliance of the vessel. After a time, when we remove the coating of the polish, we find that not only is the chemical polish removed, but the black oxide also is removed, thereby leaving the vessel bright and attractive. Similarly, the mind can be purified only by the process of treating it with right action. When thus treated, the mind gets purified from its vasana blemishes, and with such a purified mind alone can we, during the deeper meditation hours, come to renounce all activities. Before this preparation, if we try to renounce activities, we may remain physically inactive but mentally very active. Extrovertedness of the mind is not conducive to the inner polishing. In fact, extrovertedness is the very mud that sullies the godly beauty and strength of the mind. This is the greatest discovery that Hindu masters made in the ancient days in the technique of self development and self growth. While mental purity and meditative power cannot be gained without performance of right action with the right mental attitude, Sri Krishna he gives a positive assurance here that such a conducive mental quality can be created by right actions undertaken by the seeker. Yoga Yukta, one who is well established in the path of selfless and unattached activities, soon develops the qualities of poise and single pointedness of mind. Karma fulfills itself in making the yogi fit for continuous and fruitful meditation. When such an individual who has practiced the path of karma diligently, either through the renunciation of his sense of agency or through detachment from all his over anxious preoccupations with the fruits of his actions, such a meditator Muni soon attains the supreme experience of the self in himself. No definite time limit can be fixed for declaring when exactly the supreme experience will come to the meditator. The indecision regarding the time element in this promise of certainty is very well brought out by the term used na chirena, not long afterwards, meaning ere long. With this knowledge in mind, when we read the stanza, it becomes very clear why earlier means second stanza, the Lord in his opening verse in this discourse insisted that for Arjun, performance of action is superior to the renunciation of action. When the devotee asks, when the devotee resorts to karma yoga as a means of attaining right knowledge. 7. He who is devoted to the path of action, whose mind is quite pure, who has conquered the self, who has subdued his senses, who realizes his self as the self in all beings, though acting is not tempted. योगयुक्तो विशुद्धात्मा विजितात्मा जितेन्द्रिय सर्वभूतात्मा भूतात्मा कुर्वन्नपि न लिप्यते. He who is devoted in the previous verse, it was said in a sweeping generalization that he who pursues karma yoga along with meditation would ere long reach the state of perfection in his own personal experience. Here, in this verse, Krishna is trying to give us the logic of the state of inward revolution that will take place when we make the pilgrimage to the infinite in us from our own present state of finitude and bondage. With scientific thoroughness and logical precision, all the different stages of development and change that take place in an individual through Karma Yoga are enumerated here. He who is well established in Karma Yoga accomplishes purification of his intellect. Any purification in the subtle body means a better state of quietude within. The lesser the agitation caused in us by our desires or emotions, the purer we are considered by Vedanta. Through action which is selfless and without anxiety for the fruits, the practitioner exhausts his existing vasanas. When the inner equipment is swept clean of its desire waves, it must necessarily become more and more quiet and peaceful. When once the intellect is purified, meaning rendered immune to desire disturbances, the mind, which reflects the condition of the intellect, cannot have any disturbances. The sentimental and emotional life of one who has controlled the floodgates of desires automatically becomes tame and equanimous. When through Karma Yoga a man has gained inward peace both at his mental and at his intellectual levels, it becomes a child's play for him to deny and to restrain, to control and to guide his sense organs and their never ending appetites. A seeker yogi who has thus controlled his body, mind, and intellect is best fitted for the highest meditation. In fact, all obstacles in meditation are nothing other than the milestones of sensuous appetites, emotional agitations, and desire problems. Once these chains are snapped, he comes to the natural condition of deep meditation, wherein the rediscovery of the self must be instantaneous and complete. This realization of the self cannot be partial. It is not realization if the meditator understands only himself to be divine. To the realized, divinity or the self is infinite and all pervading. From the innermost sanctum of the spirit, when he looks out, he realizes nothing but divinity everywhere, in everyone, at all times. Therefore, the Lord says such a person realizes his own self as the self in all beings. When a wave has realized its true nature to be the ocean, in its true ocean vision, there cannot ever be any other wave which is other than the ocean essence. When an individual who has thus, through a total inner revolution, come to realize his essential infinite divinity, acts thereafter in his Atmic consciousness, his actions cannot leave any reactions upon him. Reactions of actions can be claimed and arrogated only by the ego, and since after God realization there is no sense of ego left in the God man's bosom, his actions can thereafter leave no impression upon him. Like a signature upon running waters, nothing can ever stay in him to leave behind a vasana. On the whole, the theory of Karma Yoga, propounded by Krishna, has been consistently kept up by the Lord in all his declarations, and often it is conceived beautifully in the suggestive fragrance of his words. In the stanza under discussion, also, it has been amply brought out that egocentric activities motivated by desires only can create vasana granulations upon the intellect and consequently dim its discriminative awareness to know, to feel, and to experience the eternal divinity, which is the essential nature of man as a spiritual being. In this consciousness of universality and supreme sense of divinity, when a sage acts, what exactly will be his attitude in life? I do nothing at all. This would be the harmonized knower of truth. Think, seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, going, sleeping, breathing, speaking, letting go, seizing, opening, and closing the eyes, convinced that the senses move among the sense objects. नैव किञ्चित् करोमीति युक्तो मन्येत तत्त्ववित् पश्यन् शृण्वन् स्पृशन् जिघ्रन् अश्नन् गच्छन् श्वपन् श्वसन् प्रलपन् विसृजन् गृह्णन् उन्मिषन् निमिषन् अपि इन्द्रियाणि इन्द्रियार्थेषु वर्तन्ते इति धारयन्. Such a perfect one is found to live not sitting like a stone statue, but acting diligently like anyone else in the world. A list of these common and natural activities is indicated in these two stanzas: seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, eating, going, sleeping, breathing, speaking, dropping, holding, winking, etc. In all these unavoidable activities of life, it is explained here, a sage or a prophet living in the world will not have any egoistic vanity. In deep sleep we breathe, but we are not conscious of it at all, since at that time the ego in us is not functioning. Similarly, when the ego has ended, all these activities take place instinctively. Even while carrying on these activities, the seer has a constant awareness that I do nothing at all. This does not mean that a perfect master is an irredeemable sleepwalker. The essential difference between the two is that the sleepwalker is unconscious while a sage is ever conscious of the consciousness. That this attitude of total surrender of the sense of agency can come only to a perfect master is very clearly indicated here by the two terms centered and steadfast. Yukta meaning centered in the self. This self centeredness can be in two grades of intensity. One indicating the self centeredness of a seeker who, through study, reflection, and meditation, tries to remain intellectually centered in the self, and another, the self absorption of one who, after the final realization of the self in himself, comes to live vitally at every moment the experience of the self, Atmavit, in order that we may come to withdraw ourselves from the wrong conceptions of our own agency. We must have a substitute knowledge bit in ourselves, which will help us in living the new experience. When I am ignorant of my waking state personality, I become victimized by my own dream identity. This dream identification ends only when I rediscover my real waking state personality and come to live in the unbroken awareness of I am the waker. Similarly, in order to maintain in myself the attitude I am not the actor, it is necessary that I must have another positive assumption to replace this negative false belief. This is indicated in the last time of the stanza that a man of perfection living in unison with the truth is ever an observer of the varieties of his own actions that are executed by the various layers of matter in him among the world of objects. Just as the ocean where it conscious could watch and observe its own waves rising and setting upon its own surface, declaring its own glory, so too from the infinite depth of his own personality, the Master watches the actions performed by the various layers of matter in him. As I am typing these lines, I can watch my fingers typing, and the more detached I grow, the more entertaining becomes the play of my fingers on the keyboard. Similarly, a sage can, once having entered the innermost sanctum of his self, ever afterwards watch the inert matter entities in him getting thrilled with activities in a thousand channels of independent preoccupations. He is unconcerned, he is unperturbed from the bottomless depth of his own being. He watches on in perfect detachment, born of his realized knowledge, and he is ever confident that I do nothing at all. But what should be the attitude of a man who is not a true knower and is engaged in action? 10. He who does actions offering them to Brahman, abandoning attachment, is not tempted by sin, but a lotus leaf, just as a lotus leaf remains unaffected by the water on it. ब्रह्मण्याधाय कर्माणि संगम त्यक्त्वा करोति यः लिप्यते न स पापेन पद्मपत्रमिवाम्भसा. What has been said in the previous stanza may be true for those rare few who have realized the truth and are reveling in God consciousness. But the strange life of detachment by which we can renounce completely the sense of agency is not available for all of us. We are but aspirants and seekers of this perfection. The way in which we can train ourselves to renounce the sense of agency will be the problem of all true students of the Gita who want to live the Gita rather than talk about its ideas. In this stanza, we have a prescription by which every one of us can come to live the life of intelligent detachment in life, resigning to Brahma, Total detachment is impossible for the human mind, and that is exactly what spiritual seekers often fail to understand. As long as there is a mind, it has to attach itself to something. Therefore, detachment from the false can be successful only when we attach ourselves to the real. This psychological fact is scientifically enunciated in this stanza, wherein Lord Krishna advises the seeker to surrender all his attachments to Brahman and continue striving. To remember constantly an ideal is to become more and more attuned to the perfections of the ideal. In order that we may surrender all our sense of agency in our actions to Brahman, we have to remember that this concept of truth, as often as we now remember our limited ego, when the frequency of our thoughts upon the Lord becomes as high as the frequency with which we now remember the ego idea, we shall come to realize the Brahman ideal as intimately as we now know our own ego. In short, today we are ego realized souls. The Gita's call to man is to become soul realized egos. Once our real nature is realized, the actions of the body, mind, and intellect can no more leave any impression upon the self. Merits and demerits belong to the ego and never to the Atman. The imperfections of my reflections in a mirror cannot be my imperfections, but can only be because of the distortions in the reflecting surface. The reflection may look shortened or lengthened according to the type of the mirror into which I am looking. Similarly, the ego comes to suffer the perfect and the imperfect reactions of its own actions. Having thus realized the self to remain in the matter envelopments and their world of objects is to remain ever perfectly detached as the lotus leaf in the water. Though the lotus leaf exists only in water, draws its nourishment from the very water, and dies away in the same water, yet during its life as a leaf, it does not allow itself to be moistened by water. Similarly, a saint in the world, as a matter entity, draws the nourishment for his individual existence from the world of objects, but ever remains perfectly detached from his own merits and demerits, from his own concepts of beauty and ugliness, from his own likes and dislikes in the outside world. Of the two methods by which ordinary karma can be transformed into karma yoga, we have here the technique of patient. Will center itself of self. End of the verse when Bhagavan says, for the purification of the ego. Third, ayuktak kamakarena, peace and unity. That when one is not established ayuktaha in the renunciation of agency, and because of his desires gets himself tied down to some expected results of his actions, he gets bound and persecuted by the reactions of his own actions. Some medicines, which in small doses can give a complete cure, can also spell death in large doses. For example, the sleeping tablets. An instrument by which we can defend ourselves can itself be the instrument for our own suicide. In the same way, when we walk in the outer field unintelligently, instead of gaining a greater glow of satisfaction and joy within, we will get ourselves more and more bound, the hurled down into bottomless darkness. The cause for this has been beautifully explained by Sri Krishna. Due to desires for specific fruits, we are mentally attached to those wished for patterns to be fulfilled in future. This is compelling life to pattern itself to our will at a future moment. If a frog were to imitate a bull and grow to the bull's size, it would end in a tragedy. A mortal finite mind ordering a pattern for a future period of time is in no way better equipped than the frog that tries to expand to the size of a bull. But as to the man who sees the Supreme Being, 13, mentally renouncing all actions and fully self controlled, the embodied one rests happily in the nine gate city, neither acting nor causing others' body and senses to act. सर्वकर्माणि मनसा संन्यस्यास्ते सुखं वशे नवद्वारे पुरे देहि नैव कुर्वन्न कारयन्. Sannyas is not a mere physical escapism but a mental withdrawal from things that are unintelligent and thoughtless. It is a mental attitude and not an external symbol. Therefore, he who is a self controlled individual and who has brought all his sense appetites under perfect control and renounced all his egocentric and desire prompted actions, comes to experience and live in a nameless joy, contentment, and peace which well up from the very depths within him. He thus remains contented and happy in the city of nine gates. This is a famous metaphor used in the Upanishads to indicate the physical body of the seeker. The body is considered a fortress city having nine main gates, which are the nine apertures in the physical structure, seven of them on the face, two eyes, two nostrils, two ears, and one mouth, and the two apertures on the trunk, the genital organ, and excretory organ. Without these nine holes, or at least a majority of them, life within the body is impossible. A king remaining in the fortress rules over his kingdom through his ministers, giving them the encouragement, strength, and sanction by his mere presence. So too, the Atman within the physical structure, through itself doing nothing, by its mere presence, vitalizes the various instruments of cognition and action within and without and governs the life in them all. This famous metaphor is used here by Sri Krishna, and he says that a self controlled man lives within the physical body, a nameless joy of pure divine life, ever watching over the activities of the matter envelopments around him. Such an individual, ever identifying with the self, continues to observe, unaffected, unattached, and without agitations, all the thrilled activities in the layer of matter, but neither does he act nor does he cause others to act. Moreover, 14. Neither agency nor actions does the Lord create for the world, nor union with the fruits of actions, but it is nature that acts. न कर्तृत्वं न कर्माणि लोकस्य सृजति प्रभुः न कर्मफलसंयोगं स्वभावस्तु प्रवर्तते. In the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, God is the supreme intelligence, ever dynamic and potent, who observes and watches over all our actions, and who, with perfect justice, dispenses to each his reward for all his actions. Here, however, the Lord, the Creator, is described not so much as what He is, as what His relationship with the universe is. The Supreme Self neither creates any sense of agency nor does it sanction any action. The Supreme has no such function as marrying every action to its correct fruits. In this very assertion, we can find how far the ordinary commentators who jump to the conclusion that this passage is a description of the Vedic God principle, Karma Phaladata, are in the wrong. Any close student of the Gita can clearly see that there is an attempt on the part of Krishna to indicate to Arjuna the function and nature of the self and its relationship with the three bodies, the physical, the mental, and the causal. If the reality, the self, has nothing to do with the above mentioned agency or their fruits, our life, which is nothing without them, must have no relationship at all with the self. And yet, where the self is not, existence and activities are not possible. Therefore, there must be some relationship between the self and the non self. And here, this strange contactless contact is being explained. It is very well known that my nose is a permanent fixture on my face. It has neither a voluntary nor an involuntary movement. And yet the other day, when I was looking into a basin of water, I saw my nose and ears moving rhythmically sideways as though upon well-oiled hinges. Even when I saw it, I knew that my nose was not moving, but all the same, I saw what I saw. Because my reflection in the water depended entirely upon the reflecting surface, it gathered unto itself its abnormalities from the vagaries of the reflecting medium. The self or the Atman has neither activities nor an agency, and yet, when in this life I function through the equipments that are natural to me, the conditioned self, the ego, gathers into itself these peculiarities of agency, action, and anxieties for their fruits. Electricity in itself is static energy, but when it is generated, stored, and sent through the distribution system and reaches the terminals in my room, and when I plug on to its various equipments, the same energy becomes dynamic. When the self, pregnant with all potentialities, functions through the matter conditions, it assumes to itself the egocentric attitudes of agency, action, and fruits, etc. The enjoyer of the fruits and the performer of actions in us are the ego and not the Atman. I do not shake or shiver, but my reflection can be shaken when the reflecting medium is disturbed. The Atman becomes the performer, etc., only when it gets conditioned by Swabhava, nature, or Maya. The divine Maya, made up of the three gunas, as the Lord Himself calls it. In reality, however, the Lord is in His absolute nature, is ever uninvolved. 15. The Lord takes neither the demerit nor even the merit of any. Knowledge is enveloped by ignorance, thereby beings are deluded. नादत्ते कस्यचित् पापं न चैव सुकृतं विभुः अज्ञानेनावृतं ज्ञानं तेन मुह्यन्ति जन्तवः. The Supreme, who is all pervading, Vibhuhu, contrary to all our Puranic concepts of stock taking gods and deities, is declared here as not taking any note of the merit or the demerit of the living creatures. It is such passages that shock the story reading devotee class, and therefore they generally ignore the Gita and read instead the glory. The concept that God sits just over the clouds, peeping down, observing every sin and merit of all the people all over the world, and that He keeps a perfect account of all these, so that on the day of judgment, each one will approach the Father who will pass the judgment, is a concept which can appeal only to simple folk in whom the intellect is the least developed faculty. The eternal principle underlying life's activities cannot be conceived of as taking any active note or interest in the created or in the infinite. From the infinite standpoint, the finite exists not. It is only when the Supreme functions through self forgetfulness that it comes to see itself split up into the concepts of agent, action, fruit, etc. Sunlight passing through a plain glass, in spite of the medium through which it has passed, emerges in its pure nature. If the glass be clean, flawless, and colorless, if, on the other hand, a pencil of light were to pass through a glass prism, we all know that it would emerge in its seven component colors constituting the spectrum. Similarly, the self passing through knowledge, jnana, emerges as self, which is the one without a second, all pervading, all perfect. But the same self, when it passes through ignorance, meaning the body, mind, and intellect, it splits up into the endless world of plurality. The relationship between knowledge and ignorance is very beautifully explained here. Ignorance cannot be knowledge, nor can knowledge be a part of ignorance. Where ignorance is, there knowledge cannot be. Where knowledge has come, ignorance must depart. But here we are told knowledge is enveloped by ignorance, just as a solitary light in a dark jungle seen from a different distance can be described as a light encaged in darkness. This relationship and the method of stripping knowledge naked is more elaborately indicated in the following stanza. The unveiling of truth is a process of the removal of ignorance and not a cremation of knowledge. Therefore, it is only an act of rediscovery and not a creative achievement. This is amply brought out by Vyasa's words in the following 16. But to those whose ignorance is destroyed by the knowledge of the self, like the sun, to them knowledge reveals the Supreme Brahman. ज्ञानेन तो तदज्ञानं येषां नाशितमात्मनः तेषाम् आदित्यवत् ज्ञानं प्रकाशयति तत् परम्. In the case of finite mortals, sighing and sobbing in ignorance, the self is screened off from them by lifeless walls of nescience avidya. The man of realization is one in whom knowledge has lifted this veil of ignorance. Darkness is removed by light, not by degrees but instantaneously. However old the darkness may be and however thick its density. Similarly, in one who has knowledge, jnana, of the self, the beginningless ignorance is lifted, and within a lightning flash, his ignorance ends. Ignorance creates the egocentric concept, and the ego thrives in the body, mind, and intellect. With the end of ignorance, the ego too ends. At this stage of Vedantic discussion, the dualists, Dvaitins, generally feel like collapsing in sheer despair. They fail to understand how the self can be experienced when the experiencer, the ego, and the instruments of experiencing, which are familiar to them in perception, feeling, and thinking, have all ended. Any intelligent student must surely entertain this doubt. Foreseeing this possibility, Krishna is here trying to explain how, when the ego has ended, knowledge becomes self evident. This explanation cannot be brought so easily within the comprehension of a thinking intellect, but by the example which the Lord gives in the second line, like the sun. It is the experience of all of us that during the monsoon we do not see the sun for days together, and we, in our hasty conclusions, cry out, "The sun has been covered by clouds." When we reconsider this statement, it is not very difficult for us to understand that the sun cannot be covered by a tiny bit of a cloud. Also, the region of the cloud is far removed from the center of the universe, where the sun, in its infinite glory, revels as the one without a second. The minute humans observing from the surface of the globe with their tiny eyes experience that the glorious orb of the sun is being veiled because of a wisp of cloud. Even a mighty mountain can be veiled from our vision if we put our tiny little finger very near our eyes. Similarly, the ego, Jiva, looking up to the Atman, finds that ignorance is enveloping the infinite. This ignorance is not in truth, just as the clouds are never in the sun. The finite ignorance is certainly a limited factor compared with the infinitude of reality. And yet, the mist of self forgetfulness that hangs in the chambers of the heart gives the ego the false notion that the spiritual reality is enveloped by ignorance. When this ignorance is removed, the self becomes manifest, just as when the cloud has moved away, the sun becomes manifest. To see the sun, we need no other light. To experience the self, we need no other experience. The self is awareness, it is consciousness. To become conscious of consciousness, we need no separate consciousness. To know knowledge, we need no knowledge other than knowledge. Knowledge is the very faculty of knowing. Similarly, when the ego rediscovers the self, it becomes the self. When a dreamer has ended his dream career along with his dream, he rediscovers himself to be the waker. The waker is never known or understood or recognized as an object by the dreamer. The dreamer himself transcends the dream world and enters the realm of waking, wherein he knows himself to be the waker. In the same fashion, the deluded ego, when it walks out of ignorance and enters the realm of pure consciousness, it becomes the consciousness which is the Atman. This relationship between the ego and the Atman and the technique of rediscovery of the Atman by the ego are beautifully described by this metaphor, which is full of deep significance for those who know how to chew upon it in independent thinking. The sage whose intellect is absorbed in truth will have no more births. 17. Intellect absorbed in that, their self being that, established in that, rich with that, for their supreme goal, they go whence there is no return, their sins dispelled by knowledge. तद्बुद्धयस्तदात्मानस्तन्निष्ठास्तत्परायणाः गच्छन्त्य पुनरावृत्तिं ज्ञाननिर्धूतकल्मषाः. With a deep study of the reality, the seeker in all his various personal identities thereafter comes to live in unison with that understanding of the divinity. His intellect gets, as it were, absorbed in that knowledge, and his mind cannot but sing the song of godliness through every one of its emotions. He becomes ever intent upon the infinite bliss which he has come to recognize as the essence in him. To such an individual, the very goal is nothing but the self, which he has understood as illimitable and unlimited. An individual who has thus educated himself upon the world of truth within himself shall thereafter have no reason or chance to get caught up again in this world of likes and dislikes. This is the result of full participation in the studies. The next stage is to live up to what is understood from the studies. The active involvement in spiritual life. Then comes complete commitment. How can we say that the ego will not rise again in such a man's bosom? The reason is indicated here. When Krishna qualifies such men as those whose impurities have been shaken off by knowledge. The impurities mentioned here are the vasanas, which are the very materials with which the ego is conjured up. These vasanas together constitute what we philosophically call the ignorance of spiritual divinity. The antidote for ignorance is knowledge. Thus, when with the rise of the knowledge of spiritual bliss, The dreary darkness of ignorance ends. The ego too comes to a total extinction from which it cannot restart its career. Without a cause, no effect is ever possible. In short, in this stanza, we are meeting the most optimistic philosophy in the world, declaring courageously that self realization is the final experience in the pilgrimage of evolution, and that in it the evolver in us shall come to fulfill himself. God realization is the last stage of growth, and therefore, to be the supreme is the goal of all evolutionary struggles, to achieve which the ego had in its self evolution roamed about so long in the field of its own self created world of finitude and imperfections. How do those wise men whose ignorance of the self have been removed by knowledge see truth? It is said. 18. Sages look with an equal eye upon a Brahman endowed with learning and humility, on a cow, on an elephant, and even on a dog and an outcast. विद्या विनय संपन्ने ब्राह्मणे गवी हस्तिनि शुनि चैव स्वपाके च पंडिताः समदर्शिनः. The wise cannot but see and recognize the same presence of divinity everywhere. The ocean has no difference in feeling for different waves. Gold cannot recognize itself as different in different pieces of ornaments. From the standpoint of mud, all mud pots are the same. Similarly, an egoless man, having recognized himself to be God, can find in no way any distinction in the outer world of names and forms. The distinctions generally recognized are all the distinctions of the containers. Man to man, there may be differences in form, shape, and color of the body, or the nature of the mind, or the subtlety of the intellect. But as far as life is concerned, it is the same everywhere at all times. Therefore, it is said in this stanza that the self realized cast an equal eye on a Brahman endowed with scholarship coupled with humility, on a cow, on an elephant, on a dog, or on a pariha. Everywhere he realizes the presence of the same truth, whatever be the container. Equal vision is the hallmark of realization. The perfected cannot make distinctions based upon likes and dislikes. In and through all forms and situations, he sees the expressions of the same dynamic truth which he experiences as his own self. Shankara, in his commentary on this stanza, quotes Gautam Smriti, which says that it is not only sinful if we do not respect those whom we must respect, but it is equally sinful if we respect those whom we should not respect. Thus, from the standpoint of this Smriti's declaration, to respect a dog as much as Brahman, or to respect a Brahman only as much as we generally respect a dog, would both be sin indeed. In order to show that it is not so, the following stanza is given. These are not sinful for 19. Even here in this world, birth, everything is overcome by those whose minds rest in equality. Brahman is spotless indeed and equal, therefore, they are established in Brahman. इहैव तैर्जितः सर्वो येषां साम्ये स्थितं मनः निर्दोषं हि समं ब्रह्म तस्मात् ब्रह्मणि ते स्थिताः 19 हरि ओम हरि ओम श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः हरि ओम श्री चिन्मय सद्गुरवे नमः श्री सद्गुरुनाथ महाराज की जय।